Hey, how are you guys? Tonight, gonna talk to you about the book review. I didn't tape our first Zoom meeting, so I talked about this a little bit during the Zoom meeting. So I thought I'd do just a really quick, hopefully like 5-minute version of what to do on the book review. Okay, so the book review is attached to the syllabus, and I'll probably put a separate section for it in the course documents section as well. And book review is worth 20 points of the 400 total, and you can't have an A unless you do the book review. So make sure you do the book review. Do the book review. Okay. And the book review, you pick a book that has something to do with U.S. history after the Civil War, so Reconstruction or later. And it really does need to have to do with U.S. history, so no books about Hitler, because I know you're going to ask, because I don't know why everybody wants to read a book about Hitler. I did put a list of books on the book review sheet. You absolutely don't have to do one of those. If there's something else you'd rather do, I'd much rather you read something that you enjoy. So, the book review assignment gives you an outline of the assignment. It comes in 3 sections. If you like, you can put part A or part 1, excuse me, part 2 and part 3 as your headings. It's fine. You don't have to. You can write it more like a normal paper. Really don't care if you document with MLA, if you document with Chicago Manual Style or Turabian, which is more of the history, social studies tradition, or honestly, if you just put a page number in parentheses, and I'll assume that that's from the book that you read. So, little tips. When you start the book review, first sentence, name the book. Put the name of the book. Don't just say, I read this book, and say, well, it was in the title of the paper, so you didn't have to say. Make sure you follow the format. Section 1 should be the shortest section, just a really brief overview, like first third of the book talked about, um, I don't know, let's say you read a book about Teddy Roosevelt. So the first third talked about Teddy Roosevelt's childhood, the second third talked about his days at Harvard, and the third, the end of the book, talked about all of his jobs as an adult, all the way from police commissioner in New York City to assistant secretary of the Navy to vice president to president, with a little bit more detail than that. But it's different than a book report, so I don't want you to tell me everything that happened in the book. So just a quick overview, about a page long. And the book review is 1,500 words, which is about 4 to 5 pages. So, and that's kind of a double space, normal size, 11, 12-point font kind of idea. So part 1, the overview of the book. Part 2, where you talk about the author's thesis. Now, history writers, not always the greatest, no offense to them. There are some really good ones, but you might want to look at the foreword or the introduction, because a historian often says in that part of the book, here is my thesis. That'll make it so easy for you. If you're not sure what the thesis is, it's the reason that the person wrote the book. And you really, really need to read a nonfiction book for this. I know sometimes people take this class in the summer and they're taking an English class at the same time, and they think, you know what? I will read the same book my English teacher wants me to read. No, that's a novel. It really won't work well for this, because the author doesn't have a thesis in a novel, the author has a plot. Also, in this, because I know a lot of you really just write about fiction, please don't tell me about plot development or characters, because this is real stuff. So it's not a plot and it's not characters. So, and don't tell me about tone necessarily, and unless you think, maybe the guy who wrote the book's just really rude. Um, but tone's not necessarily, a history book kind of thing. You're welcome to tell me about the writing style, but it's really not the most relevant part of a history book review, unless the writing's just really poor. So part 2, author's thesis, did they prove it? And if you read a biography, you're looking for something like, why did they choose this person rather than any other person in the world that they could have chosen to write a book about? So maybe they're trying to say that Eisenhower was the greatest president of the 20th century, or Maybe they're trying to say that General Patton was the most important general in World War II. And if that's the case, then talk about things they said in the book that prove their thesis. So in part 2, you're going to quote from the book and you'll put page numbers. Short quotes probably work best because you want most of the paper to be your writing. Part 3 is your evaluation of the book, and parts 2 and 3 should be about a page and a half, 2 pages each. So part 3, your evaluation. Did you like the book? Did you not like the book? What did you like about it? What did you not like? Would you recommend it to other people? Would you not recommend it? How does it compare to other things you already knew about the subject? How does it compare to what's written in the textbook? And in case you're wondering, how am I supposed to remember all this? Don't forget, it's in the book review assignment. So all those questions are in there. This is also a section where you'll want to quote. One thing I'm going to look for when you quote from the book is to make sure that you quote from many parts of the book. So if all of your quotes are from the same 3 pages, it makes me suspicious about you. It makes me think that person only read 3 pages of the book. Now, the main thing that I'm looking for in the book review is 1, that you actually read the book, 2, you actually wrote the book review, and 3, you learned something. These are our goals. So, your paper overall is accepted, not accepted, and then a range of 0 to 20 points. The rubric is pasted in the book review section, and I put a list of books. I'll go over those super quick. We'll see how that goes. And again, you don't have to pick one of these books. If there's something else you'd rather read, all you have to do is send me an email. And in that email, say, here's the book I want to read. Tell me the title and the author, and then I'll tell you yes or no. And I will probably tell you yes. The only thing that would keep me from telling you yes, because I don't really care what you read as long as it has something to do with US history, is if you're asking me to read a book that is not appropriate for a college class. I've had people ask me before if they could read a 3rd or 4th grade reading level book about, say, Rosa Parks or something. I'm going to have to go with a big no on that because usually if the reading level is that low, probably the thesis is not highly developed. It's something like Rosa Parks was a civil rights hero. Like, well, yes, she was, but we want something probably a little more in depth. So the books, uh, Taylor Branch, Parting the Waters. It's about the later years of Martin Luther King Jr. And Taylor Branch was a newspaper reporter who followed Martin Luther King Jr. around. Alan Brinkley's Voice of Protest, Huey Long, Father Coughlin in the Great Depression, is about these 2 people in particular who were not big fans of the New Deal and suggested changes. And Huey Long's like one of the most dishonest politicians who ever lived, which is saying quite a bit because the high standard. And Father Coughlin was a priest, a radio priest. He had a TV or a radio show, excuse me, where he talked a lot about politics, which is an unusual thing. He's also kind of racist, which is going to make you feel bad, except I always tell people, it's not our fault in the United States because he was Canadian. Canadians, you can't trust them. All right, the American Indian Leader book, Studies in Diversity, something I read for a class. I liked it because I have attention span issues and it's a collective biography. So it was like a 30 or 40 page biography about, I don't know, 6 or 8 different Native American leaders. So it's really good. And it gives you a chance to learn briefly about a whole bunch of people. The Fred Greenstein book is an argument that Eisenhower was a more active president than he's often given credit for. And that's, the big part of his thesis, that he's going to do stuff as a president in a military sort of way, where he gives orders and asks people to carry those out, which makes sense because he is definitely a military sort of guy. All right, John Howard Griffin's book, Black Like Me. Ooh, this is a weird book. I'm telling you that up front, and it's controversial for a variety of reasons, but the main reason is this is a white guy who goes undercover as a black guy to tell white guys how white guys really treat black guys when nobody's looking in the late 50s and 60s. It's a weird book, and it brings up all kinds of questions. Is this cultural appropriation, which no one was thinking about at the time the book was written? But it also should be assigned to you that stuff that African Americans knew from life experience was not going to be accepted as truth if it was told by an African American. And John Howard Griffin's a fascinating dude. And his goal was not to become famous or do anything untoward. As I understand his goal really was to shed some light on a very difficult situation. So a weird book, but interesting, but a weird book. The Alex Haley autobiography of Malcolm X is a classic, and lots of folks have read that. The Bad Blood book, if you're not depressed enough about race relations, that'll take you one step further. Tuskegee syphilis experiment is a U.S. government-sponsored experiment to not treat people with a proven treatment for syphilis and watch how slowly they died. So it's a very painful book. And if you didn't believe that the government could do stuff they shouldn't do, then you probably need to read that book. Um, All But My Life, Gerda Weissman Klein is a woman who was liberated from a concentration camp by an American soldier, marries him, and comes to the United States and tells her life story. It's interesting. Usually somebody wants to read a World War II Holocaust-related book, and that's one. That's a true story and about an American citizen. So, the Richard Clear book about simple justice, Brown versus Board of Education, is absolutely the best thing you could read about Brown versus Board if you want a good historical legal treatise. It's also pretty long. Ghost of Manila is a weird book about boxing matches and the Vietnam conflict. So that's about the Ali Frazier fight. Trouble in Mind, Black Southerners in the Age of Jim Crow is an early treatise of African American history, racism in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Détente and the Nixon Doctrine is about Nixon's foreign policy, which is stunningly good. Homeward Bound, American Families in the Cold War. This is really a feminist story of women in the 50s and talks about feminist kind of stuff. Theodore Roosevelt biography would be good. Teddy Roosevelt's interesting and exciting. The Al Capone book stops before he goes to jail, so if you write about that, you're going to have to note that he probably wasn't the wholesome, pure guy that the book makes him out to be. The McCarthy book talks about McCarthyism and being blacklisted for being pro-communist or just going to college, honestly, in the 30s. We'll talk about that later. Um, let's see. Eleanor Roosevelt, that would be an eye-opening book for you probably, and talks about all the things that she did during her husband's presidency. She's an interesting, fascinating woman. Home Before Morning is terribly depressing, but interesting, important book about a woman who's very gung ho nurse who volunteers to stop communism overseas, and she wanted to volunteer for the Vietnam conflict and thought, go team. And then by the time the war was over, different story, and that's pretty graphic and brutal. The Final Days book is about the impeachment of Nixon, and it's the end of his presidency. And the abandonment of the Jews mostly would be depressing as well. And we'll talk about things that our government knew during World War II about what was happening Holocaust wise toward the Jews and concentration camps and how we didn't step in any sooner. Again, you don't have to read any of those books, but you can. Someone also emailed and asked, are those books free? No, sorry. But there might be things online that you can find that are free. And as we go through the different chapters, I'll try to mention books, or there'll be books that are mentioned probably in my notes. And I'll say, like, hey, you could find that book online if you really wanted. So, I'm not expecting you to buy a book. You might be able to get something from the ACC library. There might be something online that you can get if there's a book you always wanted to read about somebody in history. If you're a World War II person, it's like, I got to read about, certain battles. I want to know what happened at the Battle of Midway, or, pick something you're interested in that has something to do with the United States after the Civil War, and I will be content as long as that it's at an appropriate reading level. And I keep thinking at some point I need a different location for these lectures because you're going to keep counting my cereal boxes, which probably won't move during the class. All right, that's it. Email me if you have any questions about this. Have a lovely evening. Good night.